I'm going to raise the issue of the concept of absorbed dose and about the problems that have emerged in the last 50 years when absorbed dose is used, as it is now, by the authorities and by the radiation protection agencies to argue that these small doses of radiation from affairs like Chernobyl, from Fukushima, are in fact not dangerous. Can we have the first slide? And this is the big question. The question is, low doses of radiation, are they dangerous? This is a book by Professor Yablokov that was written in 2000. And I'm going to try and answer this question for you today. Next slide. Well, the answer is that they're not dangerous. And this is rather surprising. Because if low doses of radiation were unsafe, then people who were having X-rays or having medical radiation treatment for cancer with moderate doses, and sometimes these doses are enormously high, organ doses of grades, would all be getting sick and developing cancer, and generally they are not. And if low doses of radiation were unsafe, then cancer rates in areas of the world where the background radiation was high would all be having higher levels of cancer than the low background areas, and many studies have shown that they're not. Next slide, please. But of course, we can also say that they are dangerous. Because if low doses of radiation were safe, there would be no health effects like those associated with the Chernobyl effects that we've already seen Professor Musso talking about in the animals and in the birds. And as far as the human race is concerned, of course, enormously high levels of radiation damage and effects on health that we have seen in the many papers that have been published from the ex-Soviet Union territories and even from Sweden and from other parts of the world. And I myself have studied these effects near Sellafield, and there are now emerging thyroid cancers near Fukushima. I'm involved in a big radiation case in America near Los Angeles in a site called Santa Susana. We have seen effects from very small doses in atmospheric test veterans, nuclear test veterans. I've studied the Irish Sea, I'm studying the Baltic Sea, small numbers of childhood cancers near nuclear sites, breast cancer near nuclear sites. I can go on and on and on. And of course, the effects that I've studied in Iraq and in the Balkans relating to internal radiation effects from uranium weapons. Next slide, please. So we have two answers to this question, and actually they're both correct. So there's something very wrong here. And what is wrong is the question. The question is at the very heart of the whole issue of radiation protection. And it's something that has been overlooked either by error or on purpose since 1952, when radiation protection began with the International Commission on Radiological Protection. Next slide. It's the concept of absorbed dose. I noticed that Professor Musso is fitting external radiation dosimeters to animals and to birds and measuring millisieverts, microsieverts per hour dose rates. But these, of course, are external doses. And although they may well correlate with the internal doses, this is the doses received by animals and by humans as a result of ingesting or inhaling radionuclides, it's not the same thing. And the concept of absorbed dose is the primary problem. It is the basis of all radiation risk legislation, and as I will show, it's a misapplied scientific concept adopted by the military in the 1950s, and now employed to justify nuclear energy and the use of uranium weapons and a whole range of issues which actually are resulting in the deaths of millions of people across the world, and having untold damage on the ecosystems of the planet that we live on. Next slide. Now let's just talk about what we mean by low dose. My operational definition in terms of conventional dosimetry, that's the one that's used at the moment. So if you went out with a Geiger counter and you waved it about and you asked it what the dose rate was, we would be talking about any dose up to about natural background, say maximum 5 millisieverts in a year, this would be, or a dose rate of about 100 nanosieverts per hour. Now the industry's definition is much larger. It's anything below around about 100 millisieverts, and it's regularly said that there's no possibility of showing that there's a significant cancer effect, statistically significant cancer effect in any population at levels of exposure below 100 millisieverts. Of course, this is only done because if they do find an effect, they say it cannot be due to radiation. So they've, if you like, put the argument on top of its head. So this is the key dose in radiation protection. And the misunderstandings about the quantity of this quantity absorbed dose here are fundamental to the understanding of health effects of exposure to radionuclides and to radiation in areas from Fukushima to Chernobyl and from the test veteran sites and people who live near nuclear plants. And of course, the many areas of the world where there's contamination as a result of historic pollution. For example, at the moment, the Baltic Sea, which is the most radioactive sea in the world, and the Irish Sea, which I've also studied. Next slide. Now, we'll give a couple of examples of these quickly. The United Nations Action Plan was based on scientific studies from the 2005 Chernobyl Forum. The Chernobyl Forum noted that the Chernobyl nuclear accident was a low-dose event. And it stated, as a result of this, that the vast majority of people living in contaminated areas are in fact highly unlikely to experience negative health effects from radiation exposure and can safely raise families where they are today. In Belarus, the UN wrote down that the dose to the population of Belarus was less than 2 millisieverts. This is approximately equal to natural background radiation in that country and in my own country, in England and Wales, 2 millisieverts. Of course, we know from the massive amount of work done by Alexey and his colleagues that the reality is very different, and that the health effects in these territories have absolutely collapsed, increased massively, and the health has collapsed. Next slide. And Fukushima, of course, the same sort of thing is being done. UNSCEAR and IAEA and the World Health Organization stated that radiation exposure following the accident there poses no immediate health risks, and the long-term health risks are unlikely because the doses are low. But of course, we already have seen what these low doses have done to the bird populations, and in fact, very recently we've learned that 44 childhood thyroid cancers have now been diagnosed amongst 178,000 people who were tested, which gives an approximately an excess risk of about 150-fold, between 80 and 150-fold. So something certainly has happened. But what did happen was that the WHO are saying that these cannot be caused by the radiation because the doses were too low. According to the World Health Organization, the maximum dose for the thyroid in the Fukushima territories was about 30 millisieverts. Next slide. And of course, the same sorts of arguments are advanced for the development of nuclear waste repositories, like the one in Sweden, which was proposed, one in Finland, and of course one in Canada that I'm talking about here, where they say that the drinking water dose would be a factor of 100 below regulatory criteria. This is dose. We're always talking about dose, dose, dose. Next slide. Next slide. So let's have a look at some doses. Well, here's a range of doses written up on the website of the Health Protection Agency, the radiation protections in the UK. You can see that the doses from X-rays are small, and you go up to a CT scan, 1.4 millisieverts, and the chest scan by CT is 6 millisieverts. You go all the way up, and you can see that the only measurable blood changes are found at 100 millisieverts, and this is the same level that no cancers can be predicted from, according to the Health Protection Agency, and so on, up to very high doses of 5 sieverts, where half of the population receiving that whole body dose of 5 sieverts would die. Next slide. But the problem is this, and this is the essential problem that everyone has to see, that dose is an average quantity. It's the amount of energy translated, absorbed from an external radiation field into a kilogram of tissue in joules. So you measure the amount of joules and you divide by the mass in kilograms, and you get the dose in in rays or in sieverts if you're looking at alpha particles. But you can see that there's a problem with internal radiation. If you look at this, at the picture on the left, which is from a paper which I've just managed to, with great difficulty, get published, and if anyone is interested in this issue, you must go there and see this paper, because a lot of what I'm saying here is written down there. And you can see that you could have, you could get the same dose from sitting in front of a fire and warming yourself, if we're talking about a thermal dose now, and it is energy per unit mass we're talking about, or you could reach into the fire and use a hot coal. And there are situations, as far as internal radiation is where that is a very good analogy. So you can get a very small amount of energy transferred to the whole of your body, or you can get a very large amount of energy transferred to one part of the body. And the part of the body that's significantly important that we're talking about is the DNA, the chromosomal DNA inside the living cell. Next slide. So this is the paper. If anyone wants, they can get a note of it afterwards from me, or they can take a photograph or whatever. So all of what I'm saying here is going to be inside this paper, which is a 50-page article. It's all there, and we're going to talk a bit about it now. Next slide. So here is one example of the hot coal analogy. This is a plutonium particle photographed in a rat lung, and you can see that a lot of energy, those little star-shaped things, are the alpha tracks, which have a range of about 4 cells. And this is called an alpha star. So you can see one part of the lung gets a very large dose, another part gets no dose, and the overall dose can be very small. So this could be called a low-dose event. But as far as the cells are concerned, it's not a low-dose event. Right, next slide, please. And this is a small hot particle from the Irish Sea, embedded in an edible mussel, an invertebrate. And you can see that these little tracks here represent the alpha decays. So next slide, please. So what are these alpha decays producing in terms of dose? What sort of dose does the cell see in these low-dose situations? Because these low-dose situations can be really, really tiny doses, but the cell doesn't see really tiny doses. What the cell sees are quite big doses. A single track from an alpha particle through a cell produces approximately 380 millisieverts. That's certainly not a low dose. That's a very large dose. That's a cell-killing dose. Then for sequential decays, if you take the radium-224 decay series from thorium-228, you're getting 1.5 sieverts into the cell. And if you happen to inhale a hot particle from plutonium-239 in the Irish Sea or in the Baltic Sea, you're getting a dose to the cell of 570 millisieverts per minute. So that's half a sievert per minute to the cell. Of course, it kills the cell. Or you get a warm particle, what I call a warm particle, which is like the uranium particles produced on the battlefield in Iraq, where studies that I've done with my colleagues have shown massive increases in cancer. In Fallujah, 38-fold excess in leukemia in young people there up to age 34. You're getting 4.4 millisieverts per day. Again, very, very large doses. Next slide. And these large doses from the thorium series, the radium-224 series, have in fact been studied. But they have been studied only with regard to the cancer-producing effects that they produce. And of course, if they kill the cells, and if they kill the people, they're not going to produce cancer. And here we have a graph which I produced from a paper by Murray, studying the thorotrast, which is an internal exposure to radium-228. And you can see for the women here, they all die before they get cancer, the ones that have been treated with thorotrast. So these are very, very large doses, and they kill a lot of cells, and they cause effects. But mostly, in terms of the radiation protection agencies, they would be characterized as small doses, as low doses. Next slide. And of course, many of the materials coming out of Chernobyl and Fukushima were in the form of these particles that I'm talking about. Particles that produce very high doses to small cells. This is an autoradiograph of a skirt, a piece of clothing that a woman was wearing. She came back from Kiev shortly after the Chernobyl accident, and her dress was put on top of a photographic plate, and you can see the particles there. Next slide. And this is a very recent paper published last week by some Japanese people who did a similar sort of thing and looked at cesium loaded particles that they've trapped in air filters. And you can see the same sort of effect, these particles here. And they actually looked at the particles, because nowadays we have all sorts of scientific equipment that can look at particles. Next slide. And what you can see on these Fukushima particles here, you can see that these are actual cesium-laden particles. They're about 2 microns diameter, the ones that they've got trapped here. Of course, smaller ones will have gone through the filter. And the activity of the particle is 2 becquerels per particle. So if you have a particle like that in your lung, it's producing 2 decays per second. And this is just cesium-137 that they measured. But in fact, if you look at the spectrum, the ESCA spectrum, they have a great deal of lead in these particles also. Now, of course, lead has a low melting point. When the explosions occurred at Fukushima, a lot of lead came out, and I had measured personally a huge amount of lead-210 in filters as far south as Tokyo. Lead-210 is a very serious hazard, because its daughter isotope is polonium-210, which is an alpha emitter. So next slide, please. Of course, why is this a problem? We've talked about the dose to the cell, but the dose to the cell is only important because it represents a correlation with the dose to the DNA, because it's now universally conceded that the problem with radiation is that it causes mutations to the DNA. These are the consequences of this are the effects that we have seen just now, and Professor Muller showed us the pictures of the birds and all the genetic damage there. It's genetic damage that we're talking about. And so the target is not even the cell, it's the chromosomal DNA, and therefore it's the dose to the DNA that is relevant for radiation protection. And so this takes us to a number of other ways in which internal radiation is different from external radiation. Because if you have external radiation, you average all of the tracks over all of the cells in the body, and so the DNA dose will be an average of all of the ratio between the number of tracks that there are in any mass of tissue